For decades, whole families lived with something invisible creeping into the shadows of their lives, leaving exhaustion, pain, and confusion in its wake. And all the while, the truth lay hidden beneath tiny footprints no one could see. This is not just a story about symptoms, it's about the way medicine sometimes misses what is right before its eyes, until nothing short of relentless curiosity forces the truth out. In the summer of 1975, in the quiet woodlands of southeastern Connecticut, something unusual began to take shape. In small towns near riverbanks and forests, clusters of residents, adults, and children alike began experiencing something that
I
puzzled
think
the
we
local
should
medical community.
consider.
They reported joint pains and fatigue that waxed and waned in strange patterns, accompanied in some cases by circular skin markings that faded as mysteriously as they appeared. Initially, there were more questions than answers. The symptoms seemed familiar, yet unclassifiable. Some families saw patterns among themselves, almost like a shared silent thread. One local resident began recording these patterns meticulously, noting dates, places, and symptom progression far beyond what an ordinary illness would suggest. This documentation began to draw the attention of public health officials, initiating a collaboration with researchers at a nearby university. Across Europe, decades earlier, physicians had noticed that tiny bites from ticks sometimes preceded strange skin rashes and systemic upsets. These European observations, recorded long before the Connecticut events, hinted at something deeper, something ancient and pervasive. But in 1970s America, most medical tools and reference texts had no frame for what was unfolding. Patients wandered from clinic rooms to waiting rooms, trying to find answers. Their experiences were real days lost to fatigue, nights filled with restless discomfort, and joints that seemed to refuse predictable logic. Yet, at every turn, the symptoms were cast into familiar categories: stress, age-related discomfort, or unexplained conditions that existing medical knowledge could not encapsulate. Doctors recorded what they could observe, equating symptoms with familiar patterns, even when the fit was imperfect. In many cases, the lived experiences of these individuals were overshadowed by conventional interpretation decisions, based on what had been seen before, rather than what might be emerging now. In the absence of a known cause, these early reports remained pieces of an unfinished puzzle. In 1976, when clusters of these cases were recognized and formally documented, the condition was described with reference to its geographic origin, a practice that underscored how little was truly understood. The initial documentation described this pattern of symptoms as something new, yet medical science lacked the lens to see what connected these experiences beyond superficial resemblance to other ailments. Then came the first crack in the assumed narrative. Researchers began to see an unusual pattern in the geographical distribution near forests and deer habitats, and a common factor stood out: the presence of a tiny, nearly invisible creature. Whispers among scientists grew louder. What if the cause was not something they had been taught to search for? What if the answer lay in the unnoticed? The scientific community stood at a crossroads: pursue this suspicion or return to the comfortable certainty of conventional explanation. For years, the leading hypothesis that these symptoms were unrelated or artifacts of misclassification had held sway. But for some researchers, the doubt was too strong to ignore. By the early 1980s, fresh eyes and new techniques had converged in an unexpected way. A researcher at a national laboratory, originally studying other tick-associated illnesses, began to examine deer ticks with renewed scrutiny. Under magnification, he noticed something peculiar: tiny spiral bacteria tucked deep within the midguts of these ticks.
See the
These
distinct cell
bacteria,
separation?
unlike
Yes,
anything
a significant
previously
improvement.
associated
Let's
with the
document this before
symptoms
proceeding.
recorded in Connecticut, moved with a strange coiled motion, almost as if they were weaving between the worlds of observation and obscurity. It was the first time science had connected a specific microorganism with the previously mysterious cluster of symptoms first noted years earlier. Over the course of painstaking investigations, these spirochetes were linked to the regional cluster of cases, providing the first concrete thread in a tapestry of confusion. The bacterium, later given a formal scientific name honoring its discoverer, became the centerpiece of a new chapter in medical understanding. But this recognition did not come easily. Researchers had to rule out competing possibilities,
The symptoms started
revisit
after the fall?
archived
Yes, the
patient
next day.
patterns,
He also had
and
dizziness.
interrogate
Okay, I'll add
years
that.
of
Thank you.
assumptions that had once seemed solid. Only when the pieces began to fit, when tick distribution matched the geographic spread, when archived cases showed consistency, and when lab experiments tied the bacteria to the tiny vectors, did the true scope of the earlier mystery come into focus. Yet, even as this breakthrough emerged in research reports and scientific circles, it took time for the broader community, medical, academic,
This
and
strain is showing
public,
accelerated
to
growth.
grasp
Agreed.
its
Let's isolate it for
implications.
sequencing.
It was in the painstaking repetition of experiments and the careful comparison of decades-old patient records that the truth began to emerge from the shadows. Line by line, symptom by symptom, the old documentation, once dismissed as disparate and unconnected, converged into a coherent pattern no one anticipated. What had once appeared random and unfathomable now bore the signature of a tangible biological possibility. And yet, even with a clear microbial suspect, the medical world was slow to shift its foundations. Established textbooks, entrenched diagnostic frameworks, and prevailing clinical assumptions did not bend easily. Many practitioners, steeped in years of practice and protocol, remained skeptical. After all, they had been trained to see what had already been seen, not what had been overlooked. The tension between tradition and discovery was palpable. Some researchers feared professional ridicule, others felt the weight of responsibility. To challenge long-held conventions required not just evidence, but conviction and a willingness to confront resistance from the very institutions that defined medical knowledge. But the evidence kept accumulating. Laboratory isolates, geographic correlations, and recurrent symptom patterns across continents all pointed to a truth that could no longer be ignored. What had once been anecdotal whispers in rural clinics was now documented data, a mosaic of human experience and scientific inquiry joined together. At last, the narrative began to change. The implications of this discovery rippled outward, slowly but inexorably. Medical literature began to revisit old case reports with fresh eyes. Symptoms once attributed to stress or age now gained context. Communities that had felt misunderstood found a measure of validation in the acknowledgement of a biological thread, something more than chance or misinterpretation. New research frameworks emerged, encouraging scientists to look beyond the surface and question assumptions rooted in comfort rather than curiosity. Educational seminars, journal articles, and teaching models began to incorporate this once obscure condition into broader discussions of disease mechanisms and epidemiology. For patients, even those long past the initial mystery, the journey of recognition brought a complex legacy. On one hand, a measure of clarity at last existed. On the other, years of unanswered questions, medical detours, and emotional uncertainty remained etched in memory. This legacy was not merely scientific, it was human. It underscored a vital lesson that the absence of understanding should never be mistaken for the absence of a cause. Today, the echoes of that early detective work continue to shape conversations in medical research and public health. Even now, thousands of stories unfold every year. Stories of symptoms that refuse easy categorization, of journeys through clinics in search of answers, and of scientific inquiry that pushes deeper into the unseen. The condition first documented all those years ago is now recognized and discussed in scientific forums around the world. Yet, the story does not end with recognition. The complexity of this biological phenomenon, its interplay with human biology, environment, and ecosystems means questions still remain. Research explores new dimensions every day. How organisms interact with hosts, how environmental changes shift patterns of exposure, and how societal systems support or hinder the translation of early observation into broad understanding. In classrooms, research labs, and community outreach programs, the legacy of curiosity continues. For every question answered, new ones emerge, a testament to the subtle, ever-evolving dance between human experience and scientific exploration. So what can we take from a story like this? Perhaps the most profound revelation is not the discovery itself, but the journey, the persistent tension between. For years, this condition existed in the gray spaces between established knowledge and lived experience. It lived in journal entries, in persistent symptoms that defied easy categorization, and in the patient-documented observations that refused to be dismissed. What does it say about the way we define certainty? About the stories we are taught to value and the ones we overlook?
We've done all we
Human
can.
health
It's going to
is
be
not a
okay.
static ledger of symptoms, neatly categorized. It is a living tapestry of experience and interpretation, woven together by observation, curiosity, and sometimes quiet persistence. And in that tapestry lies the untold story waiting for those willing to look beyond the obvious. Because sometimes the greatest truths are found not in what we see, but in what we once failed to see. If you value deep explorations into medical history, curiosity over certainty, and stories that challenge what we think we know, consider subscribing and turning on notifications. Because here, we don't just retell cases, we uncover the untold.